Spring 1945. American-occupied Germany. The POW camp at Leichingen sat in a valley 20 miles south of Stuttgart, a hastily erected compound of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The war was over in all but name. Soviet forces had entered Berlin. American and British troops controlled everything west of the Elbe. Yet here, in this pocket of defeated Germany, the Reich's ideology still breathed in the minds of its prisoners. Oberhelferin Greta Hoffmann stood near the barracks door, arms crossed against the morning chill, watching the American guards change shifts. She was 23 years old, blonde, trained as a Luftwaffe communications specialist at the Halle Nietleben Auxiliary School. For 3 years, she had coordinated fighter squadron deployments, listening through headphones as German pilots reported their kills over the radio. She had heard their voices, confident, superior, victorious, right up until the day the bombs started falling on her own airfield and everything collapsed. Now she was property of the Americans. The humiliation burned more than the hunger. "C'est mal," she murmured to Liesl Brandt, nudging her companion. "Look at this." Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. A black officer in U.S. Army Air Force's uniform walked across the compound, clipboard in hand, heading toward the administration building. His leather jacket bore the distinctive patch of a fighter pilot. The morning sun caught the silver wings pinned to his chest. Liesl's eyes widened, then narrowed with disdain. "Das kann nicht sein." That can't be. "Oh, but it is," Greta said, her voice dripping with contempt. She raised her voice deliberately, ensuring the officer would hear. "Schwarze Versager, black failures. The Americans must be truly desperate if they're putting Neger in cockpits." Several other women had gathered now, drawn by the spectacle. Anneliese Fischer, who had served in Goering's own administrative staff, laughed sharply. "I've seen everything now. Untermenschen playing at being pilots." "Playing is right," said Margaret Schultz, a former radar operator. "Everyone knows they lack the cranial capacity for spatial reasoning. It's biological fact. The Reichsfuhrer published the measurements himself." The officer, Captain James B. Williams, though they didn't know his name yet, continued walking without breaking stride. His face remained impassive, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd heard every word. He'd heard variations of these words his entire life. In Indiana, in Alabama, in officers' clubs, where white pilots accidentally turned their backs when he entered. He kept walking. "Maybe they put him in a trainer once," Greta continued, warming to her performance. "Let him taxi around an airfield. The Americans love their propaganda." She turned to face the officers retreating back, raising her voice further. "Tell me, Herr Pilot, have you ever even started a Messerschmitt? Do you know what a throttle is? Or did they just give you the uniform for the photographs?" The other women laughed, sharp, brittle sounds that carried across the cold morning air. Liesl joined in. "My brother flew a Bf-109. He would have shot down a dozen of you before breakfast. If you'd ever actually made it into the air, that is. Assuming you could find the cockpit," Anneliese added. More laughter. Captain Williams reached the administration building and disappeared inside without a word, without a glance backward. The women took his silence as confirmation of their superiority, proof that he had nothing to say because there was nothing to say. They had been trained since childhood to recognize their place in the natural hierarchy. Herrenvolk at the top, Untermenschen at the bottom, the way God and nature intended. What these women couldn't see, what their ideology had made them incapable of seeing, was that Williams had just returned from his 197th combat mission. The red-painted tail of his P-51 Mustang sat on an airfield 30 miles away, its fuselage marked with 11 swastikas. 11 German pilots who would never mock anyone again. By midday, the mockery had become entertainment. The German women had little else to occupy their time. The Americans provided adequate food, clean water, and medical care. Better treatment than German forces had given their prisoners, though none of the women acknowledged this. They spent their days in a fog of resentment and displaced superiority, clinging to the ideology that had defined their youth even as its physical empire crumbled around them. When another black pilot appeared that afternoon, Lieutenant Robert Martin, a lanky man from Louisiana, the performance resumed. "Another one," Greta announced to her companions. "The Americans must have an entire squadron of trained monkeys." "Do they let you touch the controls?" Margaret called out mockingly. "Or do you just sit there while a white pilot does the real flying?" "I bet they don't even let them fly over Germany," Liesel said. "Too dangerous. They probably keep them patrolling empty skies over France, where there's nothing to shoot at." Annalisa gestured broadly, her voice theatrical. "Can you imagine? A Schwartz trying to dogfight a Luftwaffe ace? It would be over in seconds. Our pilots trained for years. They flew the fastest aircraft in the world. The Me-262 jet, nothing could touch it." "Natural selection," Greta said. Nodding sagely, "The superior race produces superior pilots. It's simply nature." Lieutenant Martin, like Williams before him, said nothing. He'd learned long ago that engaging with this particular brand of ignorance was pointless. You couldn't argue someone out of a belief they'd been indoctrinated into since childhood. You could only prove them wrong through action. And he'd done plenty of that over the skies of Europe. He continued to his destination, the women's laughter following him across the compound. That evening, as the spring sun descended behind the barracks, the women gathered in their communal space, a drafty wooden structure with narrow bunks and a single wood-burning stove. They had begun to establish routines, small assertions of normalcy in captivity. Greta held court near the stove, recounting the day's entertainment. "The look on his face," she said, describing Captain Williams. "Absolute silence. What could he say? He knows we're right." "My instructors at Halle explained it all," said Helga Werner, who had been quiet earlier but now felt emboldened. "The Negro brain is simply structured differently. Smaller frontal lobe. It's why they excel at physical labor but fail at abstract reasoning. Flying requires split-second calculations, spatial awareness, mechanical understanding. It's beyond them." "Goering himself said it," Annalisa added. "He said the Luftwaffe would never fall to inferior pilots. And he was right. We held the skies for years. The only reason we lost is because of numbers. The Americans threw everything at us. Quantity over quality." "Exactly," Greta agreed. "It wasn't skill that defeated us. It was industrial capacity. They simply built more planes than we could shoot down." The women nodded, finding comfort in this narrative. It preserved their sense of superiority even in defeat. They had lost to machines and manufacturing, not to better pilots. Certainly not to black pilots, which would have been impossible by the natural laws they'd been taught. "I wonder if they're actually pilots at all," Liesel mused. "Maybe they're mechanics who got issued flight jackets for morale purposes. American propaganda." "That makes sense," Margaret said. "The Americans are obsessed with their image. They'd do something like that. Dress up their laborers in uniforms, parade them around, take photographs for the newspapers back home. See how progressive we are." The conversation drifted to other topics. Speculation about when they might be released. Complaints about the food. Memories of better days. But the mockery of the black pilots had established itself as a shared entertainment, a way to assert their inherent superiority even in defeat. None of them noticed the American intelligence officer who had been standing outside the barracks for the last 5 minutes, listening. Major Theodore Roberts spoke fluent German, a fact the prisoners didn't know. He'd heard every word. He made a note in his file and walked away, shaking his head. Tomorrow would be interesting. The women slept that night wrapped in their certainty, their ideology a warm blanket against the cold reality of their situation. They had been defeated, yes, but by industrial might, by numerical superiority, by the crude force of American manufacturing, not by skill, never by skill, and certainly not by Schwarze-Versager. The red-tailed P-51 Mustangs on the airfield 30 miles away sat silent in the darkness, their fuselages marked with swastikas and kill counts the prisoners couldn't imagine. The pilots who flew them slept in their quarters, unbothered by the mockery of women whose brothers and fathers and fiancés they had shot from the sky. Captain Williams lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking about his 197 missions, about the B-17 crews who called his squadron their guardian angels, about the 3 Me-262 jets his unit had downed in a single mission, the untouchable aircraft these women thought invincible. Tomorrow, he thought, would bring clarity. Tomorrow, Major Roberts would conduct his interrogations. Tomorrow, these women would learn exactly who had been guarding them, and their laughter would die in their throats. Tuskegee Army Airfield, Alabama, 1941 to 1943. The heat shimmered off the tarmac in waves that made the PT-17 Stearman trainers look like they were melting into the Alabama clay. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. stood at the edge of the runway, watching his cadets practice touch-and-go landings, and thought about the word that defined their existence: experiment. Not program, not squadron, not unit. Experiment. As if they were laboratory specimens. As if their humanity required scientific verification. 16 years earlier, the U.S. Army War College had published its findings with clinical precision. The cranial cavity of the Negro is smaller than the white. He is inherently weak in character. He has not the initiative and resourcefulness of the white man. The report concluded that black soldiers should be restricted to labor battalions, forever barred from technical positions requiring intelligence or courage. That document still sat in War Department files. It was still cited in meetings. It still shaped policy. And yet here they were, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, learning to fly the most complex machines the military possessed. Davis watched Cadet Charles Hall bring his Stearman down perfectly, wheels kissing the runway with barely a bounce. Hall was from Indiana, 21 years old, with hands so steady they seemed incapable of tremor. He would make an excellent pilot, if they were allowed to prove it. Davis knew about proving things. At West Point, he had endured 4 years of silence, the silent treatment imposed by white cadets who refused to speak to him outside of official duties. 4 years of eating alone. 4 years of studying alone. 4 years of walking through corridors while other cadets turned their backs or pretended he didn't exist. He had graduated 35th in a class of 276, not because he lacked ability, but because when you have no study partners, no social network, no one to share notes or discuss tactics with, when you are systematically isolated, you overcome through sheer force of will or you break. Davis had refused to break. Now he commanded men facing the same test, multiplied across an entire unit. The Army had chosen Tuskegee deliberately. Deep South, segregated, isolated. If the experiment failed, and many hoped it would, it could be shut down quietly, far from northern newspapers and civil rights activists. The War Department could shrug and say, "We tried." They simply couldn't meet the standards. So they set the standards impossibly high. White cadets washed out at a 40% rate. The Tuskegee washout rate was pushed towards 60%. Every mistake was scrutinized. Every failure was documented as proof of racial inferiority. White pilots could crash a plane due to mechanical failure or weather conditions. When a black cadet crashed, it was lack of aptitude or insufficient mental capacity. The cadets knew this. They felt it in every evaluation, every test, every flight review. And so they flew harder, trained longer, studied deeper. They arrived at the flight line before dawn and left after dark. They memorized their aircraft manuals until they could recite specifications in their sleep. They practiced emergency procedures until their responses became involuntary reflex. They couldn't afford to be merely competent. Competence would be called failure. They had to be exceptional, and even then, it might not be enough. Davis watched another perfect landing, then another. Let them call it an experiment, he thought. We'll show them what happens when you take men who have overcome systemic oppression their entire lives and give them wings. They were being forged in a fire hotter than any their white counterparts faced. Not just the normal crucible of flight training, but the added weight of knowing that every action reflected on their entire race. That their success or failure would determine whether other black men ever got this chance. That 13 million black Americans were watching, hoping, praying they would prove the lies wrong. That burden would have crushed weaker men. It made them stronger. By April 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron, fully trained, razor-sharp, and carrying the hopes of a nation within a nation, shipped out to North Africa. The men who had mocked them, who had designed their training to ensure failure, who had written reports about cranial capacity and inherent weakness, would soon receive their education. It would be written in fire and blood, 30,000 feet above Europe. And every word would be true. July 2, 1943, Castelvetrano Airfield, Sicily. 14:30 hours. Lieutenant Charles B. Hall saw them first. Two Focke-Wulf 190s diving toward the B-25 Mitchell bombers his squadron was escorting. The German fighters moved like predators, gray-green shapes against the brilliant Mediterranean sky, their intent murderously clear. Hall broke formation. His P-40 Warhawk, battered, outdated, passed down from white squadrons who'd received newer aircraft, responded instantly. The engine roared as he shoved the throttle forward, climbing to intercept. Mathematics became instinct. Angle of attack, deflection shooting, closure rate. All the equations he'd memorized at Tuskegee collapsed into a single moment of perfect clarity. The trailing Focke-Wulf was committed to its attack run. The pilot focused on the bombers ahead. He never saw Hall diving from above. Hall squeezed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. Tracers, bright lines of physics and fury, carved through the air and found metal. The Focke-Wulf's fuselage shredded. Pieces of cowling tore away. Smoke poured from the engine. The German pilot tried to bank left, tried to recover, tried to dive away. Hall stayed with him. Another burst, longer this time, sustained. The Focke-Wulf's left wing folded upward at an impossible angle. The aircraft tumbled, spinning, trailing black smoke like a funeral shroud. It fell toward the Sicilian countryside below, end over end, until it disappeared behind a ridge. No parachute. Hall's radio crackled with his wingman's voice. "You got him, Charlie! You got him!" But there was no time to celebrate. The second Focke-Wulf had seen his companion fall and was breaking off, diving for cloud cover, fleeing rather than engaging. Hall let him go. The bombers were safe. The mission was complete. He turned for home, adrenaline still singing through his veins, his hands steady on the stick. Behind him, painted in the sky with smoke and violence, was history. When Hall's Warhawk touched down at Farjuna Air Base in Tunisia, the entire black ground crew was waiting. They had heard on the radio. Word had spread like electricity through the camp. Hall got one. Hall got a kill. As his propellers spun down, men erupted from every corner of the airfield. Mechanics, armorers, communications specialists, cooks, every black serviceman who had endured months of insults from white personnel, who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition, who had absorbed the skepticism and the slurs and the systemic doubt. They all came running. Hall climbed from his cockpit, exhausted, still processing what had happened. The men lifted him onto their shoulders. They were cheering, shouting, some weeping openly. This wasn't just one kill, this was vindication. Proof. Evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. A black American pilot had shot down a German fighter in aerial combat. First in history. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. stood apart from the celebration, arms crossed, watching his men. His face remained composed, but those who knew him well saw the slight relaxation in his jaw, the faint trace of satisfaction in his eyes. He had known it would happen. He had trained these men personally. But knowing and seeing were different things. Davis turned to face the white officers' area, where Colonel William Spike Momyer, the skeptical commander who had kept the 99th away from real action, stood watching the celebration with an expression like curdled milk. Their eyes met across the tarmac. Davis allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The experimental animals had just grown fangs. That evening, Hall's crew chief painted a swastika on the fuselage of his P-40, small, black, permanent. The first of what would become 112. In Germany, Luftwaffe intelligence officers received the report with confusion, then dismissal, then a creeping unease they couldn't quite name. Schwartz pilots? Impossible. But the wreckage of the Focke-Wulf 190 told a different story. The empire built on racial superiority had just collided with a truth it couldn't accept. Excellence required no permission from ideology. The cracks were beginning to show. Ramitelli Airfield, Italy, January 1944. The P-51 Mustangs arrived like answered prayers, sleek, powerful, capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. When the 332nd Fighter Group received them, they did something unprecedented. They painted the tails bright red. Not camouflage, not subtlety. Red. Let the enemy see them coming. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. ran his hand along the crimson tail of his aircraft, feeling the smooth paint still tacky in the Italian sun. Some white commanders had questioned the decision. Too visible, too bold. It would make them targets. That was precisely the point. Let them know who's coming, Davis had said. Let them know who's protecting these bombers. The Luftwaffe would learn to fear that color. But first, the bomber crews needed to trust it. March 1944, 25,000 feet over Austria. Captain Wendell Pruitt held formation 200 yards off the wing of a B-17 Flying Fortress, his red-tailed Mustang rising and falling with the bomber's rhythm. Below, the Alps stretched like broken teeth. Ahead, German airspace and flak batteries that could turn the sky into shrapnel. His radio crackled, "Redtails, this is Big Friend Leader. We've got bandits, 3 o'clock high." Pruitt's eyes snapped right. 6 Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving toward the bomber formation, hungry for kills. Redtail Leader copies. We've got them. The 332nd broke in perfect coordination, not abandoning the bombers to chase kills like some fighter groups did, but positioning themselves as a shield between the bombers and the attackers. Pruitt climbed to intercept, his Mustang's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine singing. The lead Messerschmitt tried to slip past. Pruitt cut him off. The German banked hard, trying to evade. But Pruitt had learned every evasion tactic in the manual and several that weren't. He stayed glued to the 109's tail, waiting for the shot. 2 seconds. Perfect deflection. His guns roared. The Messerschmitt's canopy shattered. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away, trailing smoke. The remaining German fighters scattered, abandoning their attack run. They'd learned engaging the Redtails meant dying. Better to find easier prey elsewhere. Big friend leader to Redtails, bandits broken off. You boys are all right. That evening, when both groups landed at their respective bases, something extraordinary happened. White bomber crewmen, men who weeks earlier wouldn't have shared a mess hall with black pilots, sought out the 332nd's pilots. "You saved our asses today," a tail gunner said, extending his hand to Pruitt. "I don't care what color you are. You're my guardian angels." The nickname spread. Red Tail Angels. June 1944. Bomber Briefing Room, Foggia, Italy. Major Robert Friend stood before a room full of white bomber pilots, explaining the escort procedure. A year ago, this would have been unthinkable. A black officer instructing white officers. Now, these men listened like their lives depended on it. Because they did. "We don't leave the bombers," Friend explained, pointing at the mission map. "Other groups might chase kills to build their scores. We stay with you, target to home. That's the promise." A bomber pilot raised his hand. "Sir, we heard the 332nd has the lowest loss rate of any escort group. Is that true?" Friend nodded. 27 bombers lost to enemy fighters under our escort. Average for other groups is 46. Silence filled the room as the numbers sank in. "Request the Redtails for our next Berlin run," another pilot said. Others nodded agreement. Friend allowed himself a slight smile. "We'll be there." By autumn 1944, bomber crews specifically requested the Redtails for the deepest, most dangerous missions. Berlin, Munich, the raids where losses typically ran highest. The 332nd flew them all. White pilots who once wouldn't acknowledge them now sought them out in officers' clubs, shared drinks, swapped stories, asked tactical advice. The transformation wasn't about tolerance or acceptance, those lukewarm words that implied charity. This was respect, hard-earned, undeniable, written in the arithmetic of survival. More bombers home, fewer empty bunks, fewer letters to grieving families. The Redtails became a symbol, not of an experiment that succeeded, but of excellence that had always existed, finally given wings. Lieutenant Walter Palmer painted his 200th mission on his fuselage and thought about the War College report from 1925. Inherently weak in character, insufficient mental capacity. The sky had proven otherwise, and everyone who flew through it now knew the truth. March 24, 1945, 28,000 feet over Berlin. Captain Roscoe Brown saw the future screaming toward him at 540 miles per hour. The Messerschmitt Me-262, Hitler's jet fighter, the Schwalbe, or Swallow, cut through the sky like a silver knife. No propeller, no piston engine, just twin turbojets that made it the fastest operational aircraft in the world. Luftwaffe propaganda called it invincible, the weapon that would turn the tide of the war. Brown had 12 seconds to prove them wrong. His P-51 Mustang, red tail bright against the winter sky, was escorting B-17 bombers to Berlin, the heart of the Reich, where flak was thickest and resistance most desperate. The bombers had just released their payload over the Daimler-Benz tank works when the jets appeared. 3 Me-262s diving from the sun. "Redtails, we've got jets, 9 o'clock high." Brown's training collapsed into instinct. The Me-262 was faster, much faster, but speed was a double-edged sword. The jets couldn't turn as tightly, couldn't slow down quickly. Their advantage was the attack run. Their vulnerability was the recovery. The lead Me-262 fired on a bomber, 30mm ball cannons tearing through aluminum. Brown didn't think. He rolled inverted and pulled, diving toward the jet's projected path. Not where it was, where it would be. The German pilot saw him coming and tried to accelerate away, but he'd already committed to his attack angle. Physics and geometry became Brown's allies. Brown fired a 3-second burst. 18 rounds per gun, 108 bullets total, walking his tracers across empty sky toward where the jet would be in 1.4 seconds. The Me-262 flew directly into the stream. Cannon shells punched through the jet's left engine. The turbine disintegrated in a shower of shrapnel and flame. The aircraft yawed violently left, trailing fire and smoke. The pilot ejected, a tiny figure tumbling through the freezing air. Brown's radio exploded with voices. He got one! Roscoe got a jet! But there were still 2 more. Lieutenant Earl Lane saw the second Me-262 lining up on his wingman. The jet pilot was good, patient, disciplined, letting his speed carry him into position rather than rushing the shot. Lane didn't give him time to take it. He came in from below, climbing at full throttle, his Mustang shuddering with the strain. The jet pilot never saw him until Lane's guns lit up the sky. The Me-262's right engine exploded. The aircraft rolled, inverted, and dove straight down, shedding parts like a dying comet. 2 jets down, 1 remaining. The third Me-262 pilot realized he was alone and made the smartest decision of his life. He ran. Full throttle, afterburners glowing, the jet accelerated away from the bomber formation at impossible speed. In a straight line, nothing could catch it. But Captain Charles Brantley had positioned himself perfectly, high and ahead, anticipating the escape route. As the jet streaked past below him, Brantley rolled and dove, building speed in the descent. For 5 seconds, he matched the jet's velocity. 5 seconds was enough. His guns spoke once. A short, precise burst. The Me-262's canopy shattered. The aircraft wavered, then nosed over into a terminal dive. No ejection. No recovery. 3 Me-262s. 3 kills. 1 mission. When the 332nd landed back at Ramitelli, intelligence officers were waiting. Shooting down jets was considered nearly impossible. They were too fast, too advanced. White fighter groups had tried and mostly failed. "How did you do it?" an officer asked Brown. Brown removed his oxygen mask, his face calm despite the adrenaline still singing in his veins. "Discipline," he said simply. "We didn't chase them. We didn't panic. We flew our aircraft to their limits and waited for the right shot. 1 shot. That's all it took." "But they were jets. They were aircraft," Brown interrupted quietly. "Flown by men. Men make mistakes. We waited for them." That night, 3 more swastikas were painted on 3 red-tailed Mustangs. The ground crew worked by lamplight, their brushes steady, their pride immeasurable. The Luftwaffe's wonder weapon, the technological marvel that was supposed to sweep Allied aircraft from the sky, had been defeated by men the Reich called subhuman. Not through rage, not through recklessness, through precision, through patience, through excellence refined under pressure, into something that looked like art but was actually mathematics perfected. The Redtails had proven what they'd known all along. Superiority wasn't genetic, it was earned. Lechingen, POW Camp, Germany. Spring 1945. The next morning, Major Theodore Roberts entered the women's barracks at 0900 hours, clipboard in hand, speaking perfect German. The prisoners gathered in the common area, expecting routine questioning about Luftwaffe operations or supply networks. Instead, Roberts began with a question. "Yesterday, several of you mocked the black officers guarding this facility. You called them Schwarze Versager, black failures. You claimed they couldn't fly aircraft, that they were propaganda props." He paused, letting the words settle. "Would you like to know who you were actually speaking to?" Greta Hoffman felt a cold prickle of unease but kept her expression neutral. Beside her, Liesel shifted uncomfortably. Roberts opened his folder. "The officers you encountered are members of the 332nd Fighter Group. The Tuskegee Airmen. Perhaps you've heard of them. He looked up. No? Let me educate you. He began reading statistics with clinical precision. 15,000 combat sorties, 1,578 missions, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. He let that number hang in the air. Your Luftwaffe pilots, the ones you believe to be racially superior, lost 112 aircraft to men you called incapable of flight. Annalise Fisher opened her mouth to object, then closed it. Roberts continued. The Me-262 jets you claimed were invincible. The 302nd shot down 3 in a single mission over Berlin, March 24th. Captain Roscoe Brown, Lieutenant Earl Lane, Captain Charles Brantley, all black pilots. All superior to your jet aces. Margaret Schultz stared at her hands. Bomber escort missions, Roberts went on, his voice never rising, never betraying emotion. Other fighter groups, white groups, averaged 46 bombers lost to enemy fighters under their protection. The 382nd? 27 total. The bomber crews specifically requested them for the most dangerous missions. Berlin, Munich, Vienna. They called them the Red Tail Angels. He pulled out another sheet. Ground targets destroyed. Over 100,000 tons of German armor, locomotives, supply depots, and aircraft. Your infrastructure, your war machine. Dismantled by men you called Untermenschen. The silence in the barracks was absolute. Roberts looked directly at Greta. That officer you mocked yesterday? Captain James Williams. 197 combat missions. 11 confirmed kills. Distinguished Flying Cross. He flew over Berlin more times than most Luftwaffe pilots survived. Greta's face had gone pale. The lieutenant you called a trained monkey? Robert Martin. 89 missions. Shot down 2 Focke-Wulf 190s in one engagement over Austria. Your brother flew a Bf-109, you said? He glanced at Liesel. Lieutenant Martin probably shot down someone your brother knew. Liesel's eyes filled with tears. Roberts closed his folder. The cranial capacity you claimed they lacked? The intelligence you said they didn't possess? The courage you believed they couldn't demonstrate? He paused. They proved you wrong. Mathematically, undeniably. In the only laboratory that matters, combat. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. One more thing. The 332nd never lost a bomber to jets. Your wonder weapon, your technological superiority. Defeated by discipline, skill, and excellence. He looked back at them. Perhaps you should reconsider what determines a man's worth. The door closed behind him. For a long time, no one spoke. The ideology they'd been raised on, the racial hierarchy that had defined their entire worldview, lay in pieces around them like shrapnel. Every statistic was a refutation. Every number, an indictment. Outside, Captain Williams walked past the barracks on his morning rounds. This time, no one called out. No one laughed. The women who had jeered at him 24 hours ago now couldn't meet his eyes. Greta stood at the window, watching him disappear across the compound. She thought about her instructors at Halle, about the Reichsfuhrer's measurements, about all the things she'd been taught were immutable scientific facts. All of it was ash. The man she'd called impossible had just flown 200 missions through the deadliest airspace in human history. He had escorted bombers to Berlin and brought them home. He had shot down 11 pilots who believed themselves superior by birthright. And he had done it with a quiet dignity that shamed her more than any anger could have. Liesel began to cry, not from sorrow, but from the terrible weight of understanding. Everything she'd believed was a lie. Everything she'd mocked was true. The women who mocked them now stared at the ground. The sky already belonged to the men they called impossible.